November 1st. Madam Clerk, let's go back to item number 14.
Yes, item number 14 is an ordinance to approve the surveillance technology policy for the police department's use of non-city entity surveillance cameras and establishing a sunset date 15 months after the effective date of the ordinance.
Thank you. Supervisor Ronan.
I wanted to offer up some potential amendments to this ordinance, but I'm happy to talk after anybody wants to talk about the underlying legislation.
It's however you want to do this, Supervisor Ronan. I don't know if you want to wait to see if there's discussion or if you want to read them in for the record.
I think it sounds like Supervisor Peskin and Chan who, you want to go after me. Supervisor Peskin, me, Connie, Supervisor Chan.
Got it. So why don't we start with Supervisor Peskin? It looks like everybody else withdrew their name.
Thank you, President Walton. Thank you, Supervisor Ronan, for that generous offer. I just wanted to put this in a little bit of context over the last several years, dating back to 2019, when most of you who were members of the board at that time supported the creation of a new section of the Administrative Code, Chapter 19B, which was a provision that was actually not a San Francisco first. I think we were the 7th municipality in the state of California to adopt legislation which required all of our city departments to make public what types of surveillance technology they were in possession of, how they used it, for what purposes, and what the protocols around the use of that technology are, ranging from who the data is shared with, what city employees have access to the data, how long the data is stored, a series of use policies. And over the intervening years, albeit we had a little bit of COVID and a little bit of a shutdown in all things in the middle of it, some 24 departments have brought us dozens of use technologies about surveillance equipment that I don't think any of us knew we had. And I think it's been a very important, transparent policy that is not only for us and the public to know, but actually makes the departments think about these technologies and makes them think about what is appropriate in a very quickly evolving field of emerging technologies. I mean, these are not just surveillance cameras, which is the subject of what this particular policy is about. They're everything from numerous technologies at the airport, license plate readers on muni buses, drones, you name it. And we have, after each and every one of these policies, through the good works of the City Administrator's Office and the Committee on Information Technologies vetting, have then, pursuant to Chapter 19B of the Administrative Code, reviewed those policies and heretofore have approved each and every one of them. And there are many, many forthcoming. As a matter of fact, I was speaking to City Administrator Chu, and we are about halfway through. In the first 3 years since this law has been on the books, I will say that the San Francisco Police Department was not anxious to, nor did they comply, nor were they forthcoming in bringing any surveillance use policies to this Board of Supervisors, or that matter to the Committee on Information Technology. You will recall that something else happened, which is that the mayor, I will say at the behest of the police department, instead introduced a ballot measure that would have amended the law that we pass in these chambers. I, with a number of your signatures, introduced a competing ballot measure. And as I said on a number of occasions, cooler heads prevailed. Both ballot measures were withdrawn, and the workout was that the police department was encouraged to walk in through the indoor with their use policies. This is the first of many. This does not. This only scratches the surface of the use policies that the police department needs to bring to us. There, by the way, are a number of other departments that are waiting in the wings that have been through COIT and will be before the Rules Committee in the weeks ahead. This policy was introduced by the mayor some 5 months ago, was leading up to that the subject of a number of negotiations, and since it has been introduced, has been changed. The version that is before you after 4 public hearings is version number 3, and there are earlier versions that aren't even a part of that list. As I said in committee last week, what we have been endeavoring to do in our evaluation of this use policy is to balance the very, very important, fundamentally American values and rights to privacy in the public realm, to protect our civil liberties, and to allow law enforcement to, with rules, utilize certain technologies to make San Francisco safer. I think that has been what we have all been trying to get to. As I said the other day, is this perfect? Probably not. Is it worth a try? I think so. And to that end, I offered, and what is before us today, is what I think is a very significant amendment that does not exist in any of the other policies, by the way, including live monitoring policies that we voted for unanimously for the SFMTA in their subway stations. They do have that allowance with certain provisions and restrictions around it. But in this case, what I suggested, and the committee unanimously agreed to this amendment, was a sunset of this use policy to allow the Board of Supervisors to consider 1 year's worth of data. And so you'll see it is actually a 15-month sunset, because if we approve this policy and the mayor signs it, it doesn't go into effect for a month thereafter, and they need to accumulate a year's worth of data, and we need time to analyze that and make whatever decision we make, which could be extend the existing policy for a period of time or forever, or to modify that policy, or to allow it to terminate and not be renewed. Those are our options. This, as I said earlier, is for the use when voluntarily agreed to by third parties of surveillance, security, call it what you will, cameras. So that could be a homeowner, that could be a shopkeeper, and yes, that could be our community benefit districts, many of whom have cameras outside that are, in essence, privately owned. There are really 2 buckets that I think bear our attention. One is what is clearly a historic practice, and that is the utilization of historic footage, i.e., there are cameras, whether they are publicly owned or privately owned, that people access, not only law enforcement, they have been used by the public defender to exonerate people accused of crimes. But this is data that has been collected, that people have privately made available at the request of law enforcement for many, many years. Goes back to the days of the camcorder that was used to videotape the brutal attack on Rodney King, and has been used and evolved in many ways since then. The second bucket is, I think, the much more controversial bucket, and that is the use of live monitoring beyond exigent circumstances. And I have heard and listened to and worked to narrow, but I think appropriately so, at least for our one-year test, the use of live monitoring to the two allowances beyond exigent circumstances that are set forth in the use policy. I realize that is anathema to some. I am willing to give it a try. So I just wanted to give that background. It was a split vote in committee with myself and Supervisor Mandelman voting to send it with a positive recommendation to this board, and Supervisor Chan, who dissented, and I respect in that dissent. So I wanted to kind of give that outline. I do also want to offer, because Supervisor Ronan shared some suggested amendments that I'm sure she will speak to with me. And one of them I indicated some time ago to various interested parties, including the public defender himself, I thought was worthwhile. And while we have set forth metrics as to what we want in quarterly reporting and the report that we consider after a year, I think there's some metrics that could be added. And so I know that we will talk about all of these things, but I am certainly prepared to support and will disseminate to all of you here in a second some language that is actually even a little more robust than what was in Supervisor Ronan's amendments that she will speak to. So in closing, I will say this, which is I'm quite proud of 19B, because absent 19B, we wouldn't be talking about this. The practices would have gone on without rules, whether they were historic practices or new practices. There was no oversight. There were no policies. There was no public discussion. The fact that we are having this discussion is remarkably important. The fact that we are actually saying, whether we all agree or not, these are the rules going forward, and you have to show us what you did, and every time that you use live monitoring, and who granted that permission, with what articulatable, credible reasons, and what was the result of that, and did it make San Francisco safer? I think we wouldn't be having those conversations absent 19B. So I don't want to... It's ironic for me because there are people who are very unhappy with this, and I keep reminding myself and others that we would not be having this conversation had we not all had this transparent accountability law that we originally passed. With that, thank you for your indulgence, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Ronan?
Thank you, President Walton, and thank you for grounding us in that history, Supervisor Peskin. That was really helpful. I also am very proud of the work that you and your staff, Lee Hepner, did creating Chapter 19B. I think it's a very significant piece of legislation and is prompting these policies and these discussions that we should be having here at the Board of Supervisors. Technology is developing at such a rapid rate and involves so much surveillance at the same time that politics, especially at the national level, is becoming increasingly, and I don't think this is an exaggeration, fascist, right? There have been politicians in office, including a president, who are taking this country down a fascist path. And there are currently people in Congress and candidates every day that put out campaign videos, that would blow your mind, that you could not have imagined decades ago, that these people are seriously running for office. You have a Supreme Court that is famously or infamously eroding our right to privacy in so many ways, including taking away our right, which was a right established under the right to privacy in the Constitution to make our own reproductive choices. We carry around these phones willingly that are surveilling us 24 hours a day. We make purchases online that we don't even know who is surveilling that data and what they're doing with it. We have, music players in our houses that record everything we say. I mean, everywhere we go, we are surveilled. And not that's ever a good thing. There's been famous books, 1984, written about societies where this happened and you couldn't do it. There's been fascist societies that we can look to where your every movement could land you in jail because you disagreed slightly with the government. I mean, these are not theoretical dangers. These are real dangers that have thankfully not happened here to the most extent. I mean, we could talk about COINTELPRO in the 60s, but right now we're at this critical juncture where do we want to give the state, do we want to give the police department more power to live feed First Amendment activity in the streets when with these loosey-goosey circumstances that are placed in this law? A couple things. Under exigent circumstances, if there is a credible threat that a crime is being, or a credible knowledge that a crime is being committed, or that there is imminent threat to life and safety, my answer would be yes, we should let them. That exigent circumstance, yes, police should be able to access live feed to prevent the loss of life or safety. But these significant events, in order to best establish how to deploy officers, that is not a power that I feel comfortable giving, especially under the circumstances that I've laid out. It feels to me like we're yet again giving away more power for in this case, the police department to surveil our activities when we're expressing our opinion against the government. And that's becoming a scarier thing to do in this country. And so this does not sit well with me at all. I had a conversation with Chief Scott about this. I explained to him, because I have a ton of respect for Chief Scott. And I think under his leadership, he would probably use this power in a really responsible way. But how long is Chief Scott going to be the chief of the San Francisco Police Department? We don't know these things. And so from a policy perspective, we should be creating protections in our laws that think about what's happening to our future, what is the ambiance in government, how much should we be protecting the rights of San Francisco citizens to their privacy. And safety has often been used throughout history to get people to willingly give up their right to privacy. And I think we need to not give into those scare tactics and instead be really thoughtful about this and really thoughtful what we're doing here. So like Supervisor Peskin said, there are two amendments I'm offering. The first, and also I want to agree that when a crime has already been committed, the police gaining access to private footage that has evidence of that crime, that in my world is acceptable. We should continue that practice. I don't have a problem with collecting evidence of past crimes happening through third-party footage. I also don't have a problem, and I'm just going to reiterate this a second time, in exigent circumstances for police to go into live feed to protect life or safety. But absent and exigent circumstances, I do not believe police should be able to use live feed surveillance for those purposes. So the First Amendment that I'm offering, it's on page 2, lines 23, page 4, lines 18 through 20, and basically I'm just removing the significant event with public safety concerns. That language, any significant event has public safety concerns. Just the amount of people, the heat, the people getting trampled. That's pretty much saying the police can surveil all live events, and that makes me incredibly uncomfortable. The second amendment is the one that Supervisor Peskin talked about. If he wants to make it even stronger, fantastic. Basically, the idea is, if that amendment doesn't pass, if this piece of legislation goes forward, then at the very least, we should have an independent auditor really take a close look at what happened over those 15 months, what type of significant events were surveilled, what was the outcome, was anybody arrested, et cetera, were people's rights infringed upon, et cetera, that can be done by a third-party expert, by the controller, by the BLA. And the amendment I proposed is, on page 5, lines 16 to 19, on line 6, lines 2 through 3, on line 6, lines 5 through 11, and on page 6, lines 11 through 15, more or less. So, colleagues, I'd love to have a vote on those two amendments. If they pass, I will be voting to support this ordinance. If they don't pass, I will be opposing it. And I really, really, really think we have to consider this really, really carefully. We're not living 20, 30 years ago. We are living today when we had a president that was, had no problem trampling on every single right enshrined upon us in the Constitution. And there's a lot of leaders in Congress that are very, very, very scary. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Rowan. Do we have a second on the amendment? Seconded by Supervisor Chan. Supervisor Chan.
Thank you, President Walton. And I first want to thank Supervisor Peskin for all the work that he has done on this legislation and on this policy. And I have, sat through the Rules Committee for a total 4 hearing. For the very least, I was one of the signature that signed on for the ballot measure. So all which is to say, again, I'm just so grateful to Supervisor Peskin and his leadership on this issue. And for me, I also just wanted to help us remember that he also was the author that prevent our law enforcement to use facial recognition technology in San Francisco, and that was overwhelmingly supported by San Francisco voter as well. That said, Supervisor Peskin has really been leading the issues on protecting the city's privacy rights, as well as balancing the for public safety. That said, I voted in dissent of this because I have a lot of questions around live monitoring. I also wanted to thank Supervisor Ronan for also working on language to further define, to further, clarify, and just trying to narrow down the scope of live monitoring. With both Supervisor Peskin's work and Supervisor Ronan's amendment today, that we're narrowed down the scope of live monitoring. We're clarifying some of the protocols and process. We have put in a sunset date of 15 months from the time that it's implemented. I think that those are good measures of safeguard, but like Supervisor Peskin has said, is this enough? Is it good enough? For the time being, for 15 months perhaps, but from where I stand, I think that even with the 15 months, what we are looking at right now is not enough to safeguard civil rights, is not enough to safeguard our city's privacy rights when so much is at stake. I also do believe, especially given some of the conversations that we have at Rules Committee, including an example that some of you probably have heard and read about, is the catalytic converter theft or incidents, I should say, allege that there was suspect, live witness, there was live video, but the suspect was let go nonetheless. Many reasons for it, but that also is a good example that whether it's live witness or live monitoring, does that really make us safer? Is it really actually help the police doing their work? Raise a lot of question. That there is the existing legal process, though, that allowing the police departments to get a warrant when a crime has committed, that they could actually obtain the footage so that they can investigate and arrest. Also, during the Rules Committee conversation that I have expressed and I would like to express here as well, is that when compared to live monitoring or surveillance, nothing really beats community policing. Having our police officers on the streets in our community and actually being part of our community and deterring crime in person. So with that, I am supportive of the Supervisor Ronan's amendment proposed today, but I will, based on the principle of just not enough safeguard from this legislation, safeguarding our civil rights and privacy rights, that I still will be voting against this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Ronan. Supervisor Safai.
Thank you, President Walton. I just want to give a little bit of my own perspective in terms of this and how I'm approaching it and why I'm a co-sponsor of this legislation. We all saw a lot of the live videos over the course of the last few years, retail establishments, small businesses, and others that were essentially had individuals going in real time and robbing, and in many ways with impunity. I saw that and started to get a lot of notices from my own constituents during the summer of 2020, a little bit after COVID began. Some of the stuff I saw on social media didn't seem to be something that actually seemed as though, was this beginning to be a pattern? Was this real, a real epidemic, or was it something that was a one-off? Went down to visit some of the small businesses on Geneva Avenue, and in real time saw 10 individuals come, walk into the Walgreens while one stood outside, and within 2 minutes, they all walked out with their bags full, high-fiving, running down the street to get on the Muni without paying, and took off. This, to me, signaled a departure from many of the things that we consider normal behavior in civil society. We had a hearing in the spring of 2021. We asked a lot of the businesses to come and talk about what they were experiencing. And in many ways, it's hard to hear, but some of them felt that San Francisco was, at the time, in some cases, had grown to be one of the epicenters of organized retail crime that was happening in the country. This was real. This was happening on a daily basis. We heard businesses say individuals were walking in, walking out from multiple stores all over the city, filling orders that valued at thousands and thousands of dollars with impunity. We put together an organized retail crime working group after that. I'm very happy Chief Scott chaired that with me, along with NAACP, along with organized labor, along with the California retailers. And we set out to really come up with some real solutions, one of which was 10A. Thank you for all of you that supported that. That's beginning to be implemented now, and we're starting to see some positive impact of that. We talked about and worked with Supervisor Ronan and the mayor's office on the permitting for street vendors and seeing how day one, it had a dramatic impact in the mission. Thank you, Supervisor Ronan, for your diligence on that. And then the third thing we talked about was access to video surveillance. I know no one needs to be reminded what happened a week before Black Friday in Union Square, where millions of dollars worth of goods were taken. There were 3 or 4 police officers that were able to respond in real time. But this was all being seen on live video footage. And so, this is not, in my opinion, This is something that will be utilized in San Francisco first and foremost as a deterrent. We have been committed in this city to all different types of justice reform and reforming our policing system. And I think we've seen the engagement from our police department. We've seen the engagement from our public defender, our district attorney, all of that. And we've seen some really good reform in terms of justice reform. But what has happened over the last couple of years, and it is very obvious, criminals are very, very organized. They are very, very knowledgeable of our laws, what we have in existence, and what they can exploit. They know our police officers are ordered not to engage and chase via vehicle only under very extreme circumstances. They know that there's not live footage monitoring of many of the activities that they're involved in. They know that they can come in and not be pursued because there's a shortage of officers and security guards in many of these instances. So, I want to thank Supervisor Peskin. I'm glad we did the original legislation that we did. And let's be honest, we are putting forward a temporary piece of legislation that went through a massive public vetting, that went through the appropriate channels. And if it is not working or in any way was being abused, we can immediately come back and amend. Isn't that right, Supervisor Peskin? We can amend this legislation the minute it is implemented if it were being abused. So I have all the confidence in the world. We sat in committee. We got 3 pages or more from the police department, very detailed description on the implementation in the circumstances under which, how they defined public safety concerns, how they defined how the video footage would be stored and utilized, how the investigations would be put together. I have all the confidence in the world that this is the right piece of legislation today. I do know, and we've all seen the reports, that crime has risen to be one of the most important issues for the citizens of San Francisco. It is our duty and obligation to come forward with something today that is responding in a thoughtful way that will act first and foremost as a deterrent. We want to deter this activity from happening in our city. So I'm happy to be a co-sponsor. I take very seriously the issues that Supervisor Ronan and others have brought up. I think that is why we have the monitoring. I think that's why we have the reporting. And that's why we're working in partnership with our police department, police commission, and all of the different bodies that will be implementing this to ensure that it's done appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai. Supervisor Dorsey.
Thank you, President Walton. Last November 19th, San Francisco was among a number of jurisdictions in the Bay Area that over the course of that weekend saw a number of regionally orchestrated commercial robberies at high-end stores. This was national news. I think San Francisco, as it often does, was as a global brand and punches above its weight class in terms of population. This was something that got a lot of national attention. In the immediate aftermath of that weekend, the cities of San Jose, Oakland, and Walnut Creek took steps to enhance their use of surveillance technology to deter that kind of criminal conduct. And they did so almost immediately. And we are here in San Francisco 10 months removed from that weekend as we debate this. My concern is not the existence of thoughtful guardrails on the use of surveillance technologies, and I share my colleague Supervisor Ronan's concerns about what we're seeing nationally. We should be concerned about both the pace of surveillance technology and how it may be used by governments that are losing confidence at the federal level. My concern isn't the existence of the guardrails, it's the relative differences among local jurisdictions to respond to regionally orchestrated crime. It should not be easier to get away with crime in South San Francisco than in San Francisco. And my wish is that the advocacy of the community, the civil liberties community, would be focused on Sacramento and the state level so that we could all be on a level playing field. That said, I do appreciate the leadership of Supervisor Peskin and others to hammer out something that works for our police department and that thoughtfully balances the concerns. But after 10 months of weighing this and debating it, I am comfortable with the deal that has been struck by Supervisor Peskin, and I'm going to be supporting that. And I will be opposing the further amendments. But I do think this is something that my wish is that we be mindful of what we need to do in our city to protect our businesses and our tourism from these kinds of problems that I fear we may not be doing as good a job as we can to address. Thanks.
Thank you, Supervisor Dorsey. Supervisor Mandelman?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will attempt to be brief since we are all going to speak on this, but I do want to extend my thanks to our chair, Peskin, for working with the police department and the mayor's office over this year-long period. I think that where they got is good and has the right set of guardrails in place, and I'm happy to support the amendment that he is proposing today. I also think it says something about the ability of us to work things out in city government to get the work of the people done without having to go to the ballot. Stands in contrast to some other issues where we haven't been able to do that, but I think this is one where we're getting it done right. I share the anxiety of colleagues and others in the world, at least in San Francisco, about what happens if Donald Trump or another fascist is elected president of the United States, and how surveillance technology could be misused by an overweening government bent on surveilling its population for illegitimate purposes. But I think we need to look at the dangers and challenges and problems for San Francisco residents and businesses and visitors right now here in this city. We have a police department that is understaffed to the tune of probably about 500 officers, and that number is growing. We have technology that we can use responsibly and with appropriate guardrails that will allow our understaffed police department to function more effectively and address challenges that are facing us not in the future but in the here and now. And I think that's what this policy does as it has been crafted. So I will be supporting it. I will be supporting Supervisor Peskin's amendment, but I will not be supporting the other amendments.
Thank you, Supervisor Mandelman. Supervisor Marr?
Thank you, President Walton. And I also want to start by just thanking Supervisor Peskin for all of his work on creating the Article 19B and the framework for us to be having this discussion, this important policy discussion right now at the board, and also to ensure that the city departments have very thoughtful and appropriate policies in place to utilize the new in developing video surveillance technologies. I also really appreciate that the board and the mayor are working together through the legislative process instead of another policy fight being pushed to the ballot. I do support the use of technology and new technologies to as additional tools to keep our neighborhoods safe and our city safe with appropriate guardrails. I do support the ordinance, and I appreciate all the work that has gone into this, with the mayor's office and the police department and Supervisor Peskin and the Rules Committee on the amendments that have already been made. I feel like those all help to strengthen, the original proposal and ensure that that we are creating the proper guardrails for this. And particularly, I appreciate the fact that this is now a 1-year pilot program, and then after that period, we'll really be able to evaluate whether the policy did indeed help enhance public safety at large events and help the police, and whether it helped the police department investigate crime, and of course whether there was abuse of the policy or it was used in ways that may really infringe on privacy and First Amendment rights. So, so I do think that the legislation as amended, strikes a good balance here, protecting both public safety and civil rights. And I do support the additional amendment. I think that Supervisor Ronan described or presented, and I think Supervisor Peskin mentioned he might have something a little different that strengthens the reporting requirements, because I think that the more data and reporting that we have during the one-year pilot period, the better we'll be able to evaluate this important new policy. So, thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Moore. Supervisor Preston.
Thank you, President Walton. I agree with some of the comments I've heard and disagree with some. I'll try to address them briefly. I will just say that I am struck by and saddened by how far we've come from 2020 and our shared, I thought, commitment to changing our city and our society from a society that over-polices, over-surveils, over-criminalizes, and over-incarcerates people, particularly black and brown people, to something different and a vision of something different. And it's sad to see to what an extent, mostly based on PR campaigns and false data, some of which gets repeated in these chambers, but most of which is from outside these chambers. We are led to scrap as much of that as quickly as possible and move toward more and more police, more and more surveillance, and more incarceration. So that is my editorial comment. Coming after when I hear about understaffing, I realize we, as a body, handed $50 million extra in increases to the police department this year with no real showing of need because they were so supposedly understaffed. Now that same reasoning is not only do they have to have the $50 million extra to staff up, but also they have to have dramatically expanded surveillance rights because they're theoretically understaffed. That doesn't really resonate with me. I want to, as others have, though, recognize Supervisor Peskin's leadership in, as has been noted in 19B, in bringing us to the point where we do have this before the board. I think that's very significant. And also want to thank the Rules Committee for their detailed work on this with multiple hearings. Want to acknowledge the concerns raised and the involvement of advocates, Bar Association, Police Commission, civil rights organizations, and many others who've raised concerns. I think that to some extent, Supervisor Peskin's in a little bit of an impossible role here, which is to try to get consensus and try to thread a needle here, and I appreciate, and it was one of the signatories as well to the ballot measure, which really was designed to prevent this from going to the ballot so we could have these hearings and these discussions and shape a sensible policy. I think there's value to that transparency, but I think we're still being asked to approve a policy at the end of the day. And just because it's a compromise doesn't make it good, right? And so, I think it's too broad. I'll briefly address why. But I want to start from I don't think the police have made the case for the need to go beyond exigent circumstances in the live surveillance. I just don't think that case has really been made. I don't think there's a demonstrated need. I think that were this an ordinance that did not have the live surveillance beyond exigent circumstances and was strictly limited to the exigent circumstances and to the historical use, we'd be having a very different conversation. But look, there's no evidence that the kind of broader surveillance, especially the live surveillance that we're talking about that's allowed under this amended ordinance or this ordinance, reduces crime or makes us safer in any way. This is a complete leap of faith. There's no evidence for this. There is plenty of reason to be concerned about misuse. And I want to be clear, though, we're not just talking about something where there aren't the guardrails and someone might abuse a set of laws in a way that it wasn't intended for. We're actually looking at a law that, despite all of the care that's been given to come to a compromise that the police and the mayor and the board and everyone can hopefully live with, allows very sweeping, even on its own terms, without being quote unquote abused, would allow live surveillance, access to live surveillance of most any block, ongoing live surveillance. So Supervisor Ronen's amendments deal with the First Amendment situation and the concerns around gatherings, protests, and surveillance there. I am concerned as well, equally concerned about the other provision that allows for surveillance in connection with essentially any felony or misdemeanor investigation. Captain of any police station in this city decides that there's a misdemeanor happening on a block that they want to, and signs and says, consistent with investigating that misdemeanor, I need live surveillance of that block. That's not an abuse of this ordinance. I mean, that's what this ordinance authorizes. That is really concerning, and I think is significantly broader than it should be. And I will just say that I just haven't seen the case for needing to go, when it comes to live surveillance, to go beyond the exigent circumstances. If you did that, just limited to exigent circumstances, and you allowed the access to historical, which is, in other words, in building the case against someone, you could get the footage. I don't see the need to go beyond that. It really, that case has not been made, in my opinion. So I agree with a lot of the concerns that advocates have raised, and I think it is too broad. So I will be supporting Supervisor Ronen's amendments. I'm looking forward to looking at Supervisor Peskin's amendments, and hopefully those can be reconciled to some extent, but can't support the ordinance as it is.
Thank you, Supervisor Preston. Supervisor Stephanie?
Thank you, President Walton. And I do want to thank Supervisor Peskin for leading this discussion and presenting it in a way that we are able to balance the right to privacy, which is extremely important, as Supervisor Ronen alluded to, and of course the need to keep people safe. I have lived here for 21 years, legislative aide for 9 years, supervisor now for 5. When I'm all done, it'll be 18 years to District 2. And I have noticed with my own eyes, with my own ears, that things are different. And people do not feel as safe as they once did, and not for pure fantasy reasons, but because incidents happen to them, to their neighbors. We see it on the news, and people don't feel as safe. And I know, at least from my constituents and what we hear, is that the public is demanding that we do take a more proactive approach to improving public safety. And I want to acknowledge, too, what Supervisor Ronen said, is that safety is often used by people, like fascists, to gain control over people. And I don't think that's what's happening here, but I do want to acknowledge those concerns. I've joked with Supervisor Ronen before that I have my Italian passport ready to go. And so I want to acknowledge those concerns because I don't dismiss them at all. But this piece of legislation, I don't have those concerns in the way that I think that they've been expressed with regard to this legislation. I think that many safeguards have been put into the legislation, and I just know too, and it's again not a fantasy, that we are short police officers, and it's not propaganda in all of what's been said. It's numbers, it's data on how we determine who's calling 911 and how fast we can get there to help them. And we can't get there fast enough. We can't meet our demand. We don't meet our demand for service. We have to rely on officers for overtime. There are so many things that we could be doing as a police force that we don't get to do because of staffing shortages. And those involve things that we all ask for, like footbeat patrols, building community, all of the things that we want our officers to do and they should do. We cannot because we don't have the officers. And just for comparison's sake, Per 10,000 residents, we know New York has 42, Chicago has 44, DC has 61, and we have 22. That makes a difference. Those numbers have real life consequences. And I'm not saying that's an excuse to then surveil everyone, because that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is balanced policy based on the numerous hearings we've had, led by Supervisor Peskin, about balancing that very precious right to privacy that Supervisor Ronan spoke of with the need to keep people safe. And when you look at what we're actually talking about, when you look at what the significant public safety event, what that is, and the definition of that, is defined as a large or high-profile events in the city where SFPD, Special Events, Unit and Traffic Company manage street closures, barricades, and crowd management. Special Investigations Division manages dignitary escorts, or Homeland Security Unit is assigned to that potential to thwart a potential terrorist or criminal attack. It's not for everything. It's within a defined definition that has been agreed to. And I do believe it's a false allegation that this is too expansive and covers every event. It just doesn't. It's not in the legislation. For significant public safety events, SFPD can only use live monitoring for purpose of deploying personnel and for a max of 24 hours. This is not in every event. This is for things like a religious center experienced pervasive hate crime vandalism, which has happened in my district when they burned down the part of the Armenian church. Credible intelligence relating to homicide suspect or planned retaliation. I also just had a serial sexual predator attack another person on Chestnut Street. And yes, this is a problem. It's happening over and over again on this. They keep going out. This person keeps going after women, attacking them. And something needs to be done. We know that this is also used for intelligence relating to threats made against public officials and visiting dignitary, which I think is important. Received intelligence about the Proud Boys or potentially violent counter-protests, which I fear, and the very people that I think Supervisor Ronan was talking about, people that want to do harm to us San Franciscans. And we know that they've threatened it before. We saw what they did in San Mateo to interrupt story time with drag queens. I mean, there are people out there that do want to harm us. And again, I'm not using that fear to justify an expansive policy, because I don't think that's what this is. So, you know, I look at the state of where things are. I look at what the U.S. Supreme Court just did in terms of weakening our ability to pass gun violence prevention laws. They struck down a New York law that required people to show a specific need to carry a firearm in public. And if you've seen recently, the amount of requests to our sheriff's department in terms of those who want to carry guns in San Francisco has skyrocketed. And so I do believe there's a need for our police department to have exceptions to what they have now, which is only being able to use live monitoring or view live monitoring with a request in the risk of death or serious bodily injury. I think that we have reached a place where we've balanced the need for everyone to feel safe with a right to privacy, and for everyone to feel safe from those who would do us harm. I trust the police department to carry that out. I trust this body to hold the police department accountable, and that's why I'm going to support Supervisor Peskin's amendment. I won't be able to support Supervisor Ronan's amendment today, but I do want to acknowledge that I understand her concerns, because they, you know, where we are in our country, I completely understand. I just think that we've come to a place where we have enough safeguards in this legislation where we are able to pull back as a body if we think it's being abused. And I am prepared to vote for this today. And again, I want to thank Supervisor Peskin for his good work on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Stephanie. Supervisor Melgar?
Thank you, President Walton. I also want to start by thanking Supervisor Peskin for the heavy lifting. You did do lots of heavy lifting, both politically and legislatively, and also to your staff. I know that it's sometimes thankless to, build consensus among folks, especially with the mayor's office and people who just feel differently about things. So I just want to say thank you. And I also want to thank Supervisor Ronan for listening to advocates and for all the work that you've put into this. In the past year and 7 months that I've been supervisor of District 7, I would say that easily 40% of the issues that we hear about from our constituents are about crime. And specifically the rise in property crime in District 7. During the pandemic, some of the more difficult things that we experienced were on commercial corridors. It affected our small businesses that were barely hanging on, despite our efforts to support them and to have folks be able to use outdoor public space to serve their constituents for restaurants. But nevertheless, the steep rise in property crime did cause several businesses to go under, couldn't afford to keep their doors open when people were breaking in. So I, perhaps feel a little differently about our use of technology than some of my colleagues. I think technology on the whole has made our lives better. Is just a tool. And despite not always, to Supervisor Stephanie's comments, I don't always trust our police department. But I think that the issue here is not to restrict surveillance technology. It is to reform those aspects of our policing that we don't think are appropriate for modern times. So also, it occurs to me that a captain of a precinct can right now set up on a block, Supervisor Preston, to your comments. If surveillance is needed by a police officer, they can send a police officer to that block. And it is, to me, a little less intimidating to have a camera there than to have a police officer. So I think that I will be supporting Supervisor Peskin's amendment and supporting the legislation as amended. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Melgar. Supervisor Peskin?
Thank you, colleagues, for all of the plaudits. I don't actually think they are deserved, but I am indeed trying to make the best of it and clearly have not reached consensus. Insofar as Supervisor Ronan's amendments that have been made and seconded, interestingly enough, only would remove one of the three authorized uses around significant events, which, as Supervisor Stephanie correctly stated, we limited to the sole purpose of troop deployment in major events, and did so in a back and forth with the police department. And I would like to afford the police department the opportunity to address that specific issue. I actually thought it was number 3 that was going to be the more controversial issue, but Supervisor Ronan's amendments actually keep those in. So I would like to afford Ms. Stevens from the police department the opportunity to address number 2. We did, and by the way, if you watched this in committee, I'm sorry for the repetition, but for people who didn't see it in committee, I think it's worth rehearing. And there are some very clear constraints around that use as it relates to significant events as defined. So if that's okay with colleagues, I think Ms. Stevens has some actual information that may be worth your hearing.
Just hold on one second, Ms. Stevens, because one, I do not wish to turn this into a committee hearing, but I do want to say, do you have an amendment to move?
So, what I was going to offer, and I have emailed to you after I spoke to it, and I can speak to it now, is the metric amendment that is very similar to a portion of what Supervisor Ronan suggested, which is on page 5 starting at line 19, for live monitoring. The quarterly reports, this is existing language, shall identify whether each request was granted or denied by the captain or member in rank above captain, and the justification for granting the request if it was granted, including the reason or reasons why the captain or member in rank above captain found the information credible, whether the request was granted by the non-city entity, and then add the following language, which was suggested, I believe, by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and massaged just a little bit because it didn't have any temporal or geographic boundaries, to add the total cost to the department, including any staff time and other costs associated with the request and usage, criminal incidents in a 1-block radius of the location of the camera for the month prior to the live monitoring, as well as the month following the live monitoring. So just additional reporting requirements. But I'm happy to speak to those after we vote on the first set of amendments.
So are you moving those?
I am happy to move those subsequent to voting on Supervisor Ronen's more extensive amendments. But yes, for the purpose of having 2 to vote on, I'm happy to make a motion for that backup amendment.
We have a second? Seconded by Supervisor Mandelman. So before because I do, I did thank you to all of my colleagues for your statements this afternoon, and I do want to appreciate all the work that has gone into something I consider a dead issue, but most certainly a lot of folks have worked hard to try to come to some consensus, some type of agreement. For me, I do want to dispel the myth that our police department cannot already get footage from private cameras that will help them lead to arrest. Like, I have to dispel that myth. You can do that right now. It happens right now. I've seen it happen, been a part of conversations where it happens. So I do want to dispel the myth that people think that our police department cannot right now work with people to get footage from their private cameras that have led to arrests and that do lead to arrests. I just have to make sure that that is stated for the record. And precedent for me is always an issue. And I think that when we make decisions, we have to remember the precedent that we're always setting. And the fact that, in my opinion, this could even possibly lead to violations of people's civil liberties is a strong enough problem for me. I know the thought process is just trust us, just trust the police department. But the reality is people have been violating civil liberties since my ancestors were brought here from an entirely, completely different continent. This police department used the DNA of a rape victim to make an arrest on the rape victim. So this whole just trust the police department, I don't know where we get that from. And, this is not a knock on the chief. It's not a knock on Deputy Chief Lazar. But the reality of it is, when you set a precedent like this, you still are allowing people to be determining what the implementation of a policy is like. And we all know that people make mistakes. And I'm not willing to do anything to further tool a violation of civil liberties. The simple fact that these abuses in civil liberties can be violated, to me, is problematic at best with this policy, and definitely opens a can of worms for a tremendous amount of civil liberty violations at worst. As someone who has to consistently remind people in leadership of constitutional protections, these types of policies are what I actually fear the most, especially as a law-abiding black man. And, most certainly I've made mistakes in my younger days and done some things wrong. But even as a law-abiding black man, my civil liberties have been violated. This is dangerous, even with the provisions and best intentions. And I've shared this conversation with our chief of police as well. There is no such thing as immediately changing negative effects. No such thing. We still have people locked up for things that are now legal. People locked up for things that are now legal, because the hardest thing to do, I would say, in this city, in this country, in this world, is to right a wrong. That's the hardest thing to do. You can ask the slaves, you can ask people who lived in internment camps, you can ask people who worked on the railroads, particularly, basically, as slaves. The hardest thing to do in this country is to right a wrong. When you put a law on the books, changing that law is not just as easy and arbitrary as is made to believe in some of these conversations that I've heard. And this is not par for the course. This policy, this legislation has the sole ability to affect the already slow-pacing reforms we have in place in a major negative way. You know, I can't be a part of setting that precedent, and I really think it's unfortunate that we might be willing to do that through this legislation. Some of the examples given by my colleagues, who I respect tremendously, are actually solvable with the current surveillance that police officers are allowed to use. If you run in a store and steal items, you're caught on camera. You can be caught by the camera that, of course, is already in place by that particular store, or use somebody's private camera across the street. If you break the glass of a car window, which my car has been broken into, I've definitely lost items, and it was definitely expensive and been victimized. You will be caught on camera, and the footage can be used. Live feeds don't solve any of this. And if the argument is we don't have enough officers, then who in the heck is responding to these live feed calls? Explain that part to me. If we don't have enough police, who's responding to these live feed calls as a result of this legislation? So, you know, this is really bad policy and ineffective evidence, in my personal opinion. Again, my rights have been violated through the course of my life, and so many other people that I know. And to add another tool to that violation is just something I don't believe that we should do. And you know, I respect the work of everybody in this chamber, but there is no way, from what I know about human beings and human error, that I could ever support a policy like this. And that's just a reality. So I wanted to make sure I stated that for the record. Supervisor Ronan, did you have something, or did you want to let Ms. Stevens?
I don't think it's necessary. I watched the whole hearing, and it was, you know, Supervisor Chan's comments in the hearing that truly inspired me to draft these amendments. I thought Supervisor Chan made, you know, a series of excellent points, and I thought you were amazing. So I'm sorry I didn't do it earlier, but it was watching that hearing that led me to have the passion to have this conversation today. Now, a couple things I want to say. Number one, I'm not surprised that Supervisor Peskin is surprised that we didn't remove prong number 3, which I too, Supervisor Preston, have a major issue with the misdemeanor part specifically. I think that's problematic for a million reasons. However, in the spirit of trying to get something through that would last for 15 months, and knowing this board and knowing the propaganda machine in the press right now around the state of San Francisco, I chose to leave that alone and try to appeal to our privacy rights and our First Amendment right not to be surveilled by the police when we are expressing an opinion, often about controversial issues. And I too, Supervisor or President Walton, am quite shocked by this board's actions, and this is the city of San Francisco. It's a sad state of affairs, but you know, what are you going to do? I also wanted to make the point that the Supervisor Peskin's amendments are very different from the amendments that I am suggesting in one major way. I would be happy to add Supervisor. So let's take my amendments in 2 parts, because I'm not sure everyone will vote the same way on both parts. The first part, I think it's clear there may be 4 of us that support it, and the rest won't, and that's one thing. But the second part requires an independent audit of this information. We are not going to let the police themselves, right? This is a power that the police wants. It's incredibly controversial. It brings up a lot of civil liberty issues, a lot of privacy issues. We should have an independent entity like the controller, like the budget and legislative analyst, review those metrics. Now, we've laid out some additional metrics. Supervisor Peskin added a metric in his amendment that I love and would be happy to add into the metric of the second amendment. I think that makes total sense, but it is not the same amendment for that main reason. So I don't know, Supervisor Peskin, if you would be willing to combine it for the second part only, and if President Walton were allowed to have two separate votes on the amendments.
You can split your own amendments.
Yeah.
I can split the amendments. Yeah, so I'll split the amendments. What I would like to do ideally, and want to see if Supervisor Peskin is amenable to this, is split the two amendments. The first amendment, which has to do with removing live monitoring at events that don't involve an exigent circumstance, right? So other types of events. Remove that completely. Have a vote on that. The second amendment is about the metrics of the data that the police department is required to collect and asking for an independent audit and review and analysis of that data. And I believe with that second amendment, there's an opportunity for Supervisor Peskin and I to combine our two amendments and to have a vote on that if Supervisor Peskin is amenable.
So first, let me make sure Supervisor Chan is okay with your amendments being voted on separately as your second. So we will take the first one separately, and then I believe it's in order to have a discussion, if I'm not mistaken, about what you and Supervisor Peskin may want to do after this first motion amendment is passed or failed. Supervisor Peskin, is it just burning? Is your burning desire for us to have? Thank you. All right, Supervisor Safai, I think he may want to have a committee hearing.
No, I'd like point of order. I'm not necessarily clear what's being divided out, so I'd like that read into the record so I'm clear.
That's a point of information.
Point of information.
It's not a point of order, but thank you, Supervisor Safai. So, Supervisor Ronan, can you provide that clarity, please?
So the first vote that we're about to have is on page 2 to remove the section called significant events with public safety concerns. Mm-hmm. And on page 4, on line 18, remove that the same section. So this, in other words, this policy.
And on page 7, sub H.
Yes, that's right. So, do you understand now what that first amendment is?
I did. I wanted to make sure it was read clearly into the record that you were talking about 3 specific spaces.
It was read.
I had not, but she also divided it, and she mentioned just one sentence. So I just wanted to just point of information.
So if we could have a vote on that first.
So that'll be the first vote.
Correct. And are you clear about the second one, Supervisor Safai?
Let's do the first one first.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So we have a motion to move forward the first set of amendments made by Supervisor Ronan, seconded by Supervisor Chan. Madam Clerk, did we get that recorded?
Yes, the first set of amendments on Supervisor Ronan's amendments.
Thank you so much. Would you please call the roll for that amendment?
Yes, Supervisor Mandelman. No. Mandelman, no. Supervisor Marr. No. Marr, no. Supervisor Melgar. No. Melgar, no. Supervisor Peskin.
No.
Peskin, no. Supervisor Preston. Preston, aye. Supervisor Ronan.
Aye.
Ronan, aye. Supervisor Safai.
No.
Safai, no. Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, no. Supervisor Walton.
Aye.
Walton, aye. Supervisor Chan. Aye. Chan, aye. Supervisor Dorsey. No. Dorsey, no. There are 4 ayes and 7 noes with Supervisors Mandelman, Marr, Melgar, Peskin, Safai, Stephanie, and Dorsey in the dissent.
Thank you. And by a vote of 7-4, the motion to amend Does not pass. All right. Supervisor Peskin?
Yeah, let's see if we can do this together. So I think there are a couple, three things going on here. One is the language that Supervisor Ronan has proposed on page 6. Well, the meat of it is on page 6 at lines 2 and 3, which is language that says the total cost to the department, including any staff time and other costs associated with the request and usage. And I have slightly more robust language that I read into the record, so I would like to posit that for a second. The second is that in Supervisor Ronan's version, there are metrics for pulling of historical footage and metrics for live monitoring. I would like to submit to all of you that the metrics for pulling historic footage, and mind you, and respectfully, Mr. President, contrary to what you said, there have been no real rules of the road for the pulling of historical footage until this policy. So, yes, it is a historic practice, and yes, it has gone on for decades, and doesn't actually, no offense to the bar, require a warrant if people voluntarily wish to provide it to law enforcement. But I would submit to you that that is not the best, given the ubiquity of that practice, that metrics around that may not be the best use of time, as compared to what I think we are all rightfully concerned about, which is live monitoring metrics. So I would suggest that we only apply these more robust metrics to live monitoring, and I would go further to the language that Supervisor Ronan has proposed at the bottom of that paragraph in gray on page 6, starting at line 12, which is that this board intends to identify strategies for, and I want to talk a little bit about the word independent, but for evaluation of the efficacy based on the review of the quarterly reports. I'm fine with that. And I think that we have at our disposal, and we can search this, we can do this prospectively, the Budget and Legislative Analyst's Office and the Controller's Office that can assist us in evaluating that information. So just as long as independent doesn't mean that we are going to go hire a third-party consultant, but that we are going to utilize resources within the government that are already available to us, I'm fine with that as we do a de novo independent evaluation after a year. So I would suggest that we, and Deputy City Attorney Pearson, you can help me here, but I suggest that we go with the language that I passed around to everybody earlier in the meeting, which I read into the record, which is the 4 live monitoring requests, adding the metrics of total cost and criminal incidents, as previously discussed, and then adding a provision which would say after the last paragraph in the subsection data security that begins with reporting, a new paragraph is inserted that reads, the department understands that the board intends to identify strategies for independent, insert the word city, evaluation of the efficacy of the policy based on review of the SFPD's quarterly reports and any other information relevant to making such an evaluation. So if that is acceptable to the parties, and I see a thumbs up from Supervisor Ronan, we have a second amendment for us to vote on.
Combined. Madam Clerk or Deputy City Attorney Pearson, anything we need to do from a parliamentary standpoint to combine these two?
Deputy City Attorney Ann Pearson, I understand the amendment that's been proposed. I think Supervisor Peskin has accurately and adequately described it for the record, and I'm able to, to put that into writing afterwards.
Thank you. Supervisor Chan?
I think I just need clarification to understand the language and the amendment that, and that if Supervisor Ronan is agreeing to what Supervisor Peskin is proposing, that for page 6, and that there is a language difference between what Supervisor Ronan had proposed on line 3 versus what Supervisor Peskin proposed on his version is actually page 5, line 25, and that is specifically mentioning in a 1 block radius of the location of the camera for the month prior to the live monitoring as well as the month following the live monitoring. So we're agreeing to combine that language, which is adopting what Supervisor Peskin's. Now, there is, though, in Supervisor Ronan's on page 6, on her version that she shared with us on page 6, line 5, that's specifically for a procedure or protocol for historical footage request. But from what Supervisor Peskin has mentioned, that it's agreeing to a live monitoring request, not for historical footage request. So I just want to understand that are we addressing from starting from page 6, line 5, from Supervisor Ronan's version, are we addressing historical footage requests or are we addressing live monitoring footage request?
So I am agreeing to removing the historical footage request.
And sorry, adopting live monitoring.
Yes, so the information that will be collected and then analyzed by an independent city department like the controller of the BLA will be just of the live monitoring incidents.
Which would apply to, in the authorized use policy, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Exigency, significant events, and the misdemeanor, felony, live monitoring provisions.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Chan. Just for my clarity, Supervisor Peskin, how are we going to have independent review or oversight if we leave it up to another city department or another department under the auspices of this government?
We respectfully do it all the time. I mean, that's why the budget and legislative analyst works for the Board of Supervisors and was created in around 1970, 71.
But they don't work for, they work for us.
True.
Okay. So you're talking about something like the BLA.
Right. Or as Supervisor Ronan suggested, the Controller's Office, which is an office that, as a constitutional matter, is confirmed by the Board of Supervisors. And the way Supervisor Ronan wrote this paragraph, it says that the board intends to identify strategies for independent, and then I inserted the word city. I'm happy to say for the budget and legislative analyst, we can just we don't have to identify strategies. If you want to further refine this on the spot, the department understands the board intends to have the Board of Supervisors budget and legislative analysts evaluate the efficacy.
That works?
Yeah, I agree.
Perfect. Thank you for that clarity.
Hold on, Ms. Pearson, you good with that?
I am good with that. This is, of course, just an amendment to the police department's policy. And so they're not really in a position to require that the BLA do this report. I think it's appropriate to put that here, but the board may still need to act by motion to direct it.
Thank you. Supervisor Preston?
President Walton, I just, and maybe we could do this between now and a second reading. I just don't know if we've heard from the BLA about capacity and what this entails. And I just want to make sure, as someone who, fought in the budget process pretty hard, and thank you, colleagues, for all supporting the relatively minimal increase to BLA capacity so they could, work with us more closely on oversight work. It's a long overdue increase. So I have no idea. I don't know exactly what this review entails, but and I don't think we want to hear from them live on the spot, but just want to make sure that if we're going to write it in for them, that we make sure they have capacity to fulfill that.
I have a strong suspicion also that this body can do what we need to do to make sure that that capacity exists. Supervisor Chan?
Just want to clarify too with our Deputy City Attorney Pearson that are these amendments also considered substantive?
No, they are not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, did you get everything for the record?
I have captured all the amendments and the revisions to the one Supervisor Peskin added from Supervisor Ronan's. Yes.
Thank you so much. Roll call vote,
Do we
please.
need a second for that? I mean, because now we've combined two motions, we should probably do it correctly.
I
You move.
will withdraw my original motion.
You okay with
for
that, Supervisor
the truncated
Mandelman?
thing, if Supervisor Mandelman, my second, agrees, and am happy with Supervisor Ronan either to make the motion as stated or second it.
Got to pick one, Supervisor.
I will motion made.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Seconded by Supervisor Ronan. Madam Clerk, on the motion.
On the motion as offered by Supervisor Peskin, seconded by Supervisor Ronan. And just to clarify, since we were, Supervisor Peskin, you withdrew the previous amendment. Supervisor Mandelman, do you concur in that one? Okay, thank you. On the amendment Supervisor Peskin just stated, Supervisor Mandelman. Mandelman, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. Supervisor Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Preston.
Aye.
Preston, aye. Supervisor Ronan.
Aye.
Ronan, aye. Supervisor Safai.
Aye.
Safai, aye. Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, aye. Supervisor Walton.
Aye.
Walton, aye. Supervisor Chan. Chan, aye. Supervisor Dorsey. Dorsey, aye. There are 11 ayes.
Thank you. Motion to amend carries unanimously. Madam Clerk, on the amended item.
Double checking with the city attorney, was there a remaining balance on Supervisor Ronan's amendments? No. Okay. Right. All right. On the ordinance as amended, Supervisor Mandelman. Mandelman, aye. Supervisor Marr.
Aye.
Marr, aye. Supervisor Melgar.
Aye.
Melgar, aye. Supervisor Peskin.
Aye.
Peskin, aye. Supervisor Preston.
No.
Preston, no. Supervisor Ronan.
No.
Ronan, no. Supervisor Safai.
Aye.
Safai, aye. Supervisor Stephanie. Stephanie, aye. Supervisor Walton.
No.
Walton, no. Supervisor Chan. Chan, no. Supervisor Dorsey. Dorsey, aye. There are 7 ayes and 4 noes with Supervisors Preston, Ronan, Walton, and Chan in the dissent.
By a vote of 7 to 4, the amended item number 14 passes. Madam